Michael, ya estamos listos.
Good morning. Buenos dias a todos y a todas. I'm Michael Shifter, president of the Inter-American Dialogue. I want to welcome everybody and wish everybody a Happy New Year. Feliz año. On Monday, Daniel Ortega was sworn in for his fourth consecutive term as Nicaragua's president, just 2 months after what were widely regarded as sham elections with no legitimacy, with all serious candidates who might pose a challenge to Ortega in jail or in exile, in a context of repressive rule and a brutal crackdown against dissidents and civil society leaders, the likes of which the region has not seen for decades. Ahead of the ceremony, Lauro Chinchilla, the former president of Costa Rica, called Ortega a dictator and tweeted, quote, "He shows his back to a people who did not vote for him, isolated from the world that does not recognize his election, under a legacy of horror and pain." Also, just before the ceremony, the United States and the European Union imposed sanctions on several key figures in the regime responsible for human rights violations. Since the 2018 crisis in Nicaragua, the dialogue under Manuel Orozco's direction and leadership has focused sustained attention on the grave and deteriorating situation in Nicaragua in an effort to improve the alarming human rights and humanitarian conditions and help prepare the ground for an eventual democratic transition. This morning, we will focus on the outlook for 2022 and explore possibilities for some relief and some reform in the hemisphere's second poorest country that has witnessed a growing emigration in 2021, not only to neighboring Costa Rica, but notably to the United States as well. We will want to consider this morning some new elements that we haven't discussed previously that might shape different scenarios, including a new government that will begin in Honduras on January 27th, and also Ortega's decision to withdraw from the Organization of American States, and also to break ties with Taiwan and establish relations with China. What do all these developments mean? What are the implications? Will be a topic that we want to review this morning. I'm very heartened to see the response to this event, with over 400 people have registered, and we hope this is a measure of the interest and concern in the United States, across the hemisphere, and even globally, to the profoundly serious and tragic situation of Nicaragua and its people. We're very fortunate this morning to have a diverse representation of relevant actors concerning Nicaragua, all of whom are playing and will continue to play fundamental roles in working towards political change and reform in that beleaguered country. Manuel assures me that all of the speakers are first rate, starting with the moderator, who is Manuel. Seriously, the speakers I know are all excellent, and we are grateful for their time and participation in this event. Let me introduce them briefly, and you can see their full bios on our website. We are joined, as I mentioned, by President Chinchilla, the former president of Costa Rica, and also I want to mention, very relevant for today's event, the co-chair of the Inter-American Dialogue, in other words, my boss. Thank you, President Chinchilla, for joining us. We're also delighted to have with us a good friend, Canada's ambassador to the OAS, Huan Set, and Canada has been playing a very important role. So we're very delighted to have the ambassador with us to share his views. Also a very good friend, a longtime friend, personally and of the dialogue, Carlos Fernando Chamorro, a leading journalist of Nicaragua, editor of Confidencial, who joins us from Costa Rica, where he is currently in exile. And we want to give a warm welcome to Carlos Fernando and thank him. We're also joined by Ana Lucia Alvarez. She's an economist by training, but since 2018, the Nicaraguan crisis, has worked very actively as a leading human rights advocate. And she will share her perspective on prisoner release issues. We're also joined by Jesus Tefel, who is who of the National Blue and White Unity. He was a member for the Political Council for 2 periods in 2019, 2020, and again in 2020-21. He was also the executive secretary of the National Coalition. And I think nobody is more knowledgeable about the opposition, the role of the opposition today than Jesus. So we also want to welcome him. He is also joins us from Costa Rica, where he is in exile as well. And finally, last but not least, surely is Gonzalo Conque, who is not in exile. He is the Chief of Staff to the Secretary General of the Organization of American States, Luis Almagro, and also a good friend. And we're very, very grateful to Gonzalo for joining us. So with that, I want to thank again all of our speakers. Thanks to the friends and colleagues who have joined the event. And after some initial questions, we'll invite you to pose your own questions and share some comments that you might have had on this situation. And of course, a special thanks again to Manuel for organizing this, for all that he does on Nicaragua, and also on migration issues and development at the dialogue, and also to Denise Delgado for her help in organizing this event. So I look forward to a very interesting and important discussion this morning. Thanks to everybody. And with that, let me turn it over to Manuel.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. And good morning, everyone. And thank you for participating into this, this panel de lujo, we will say in Spanish. We're really delighted to count with you. Definitely, each one of you has been involved directly or indirectly and as individuals in different efforts to bring a peaceful solution to the political crisis in Nicaragua. And so having you around from different angles, I think it's important to have this conversation with a focus on what kind of solutions we can find within the context of this new development, as Michael mentioned. My first question, open question to everyone, is basically, what do we make out of Daniel Ortega's statement on the inauguration, that he says basically tabula rasa from now on, borrón y cuenta nueva? What does that mean? And specifically, President Chinchilla, my key question is basically, what do you recommend to international players, international community, Central American leaders, given that under the present circumstances, there is no signaling of opening, of prisoner release or dialogue in mind? What can the international community do with Nicaragua on these regards? And Ambassador Asset, the OAS basically has issued 10 resolutions with 2/3 of the member states voting in favor of a political transition, a solution to the crisis, to mediated effort, with even the offer of the OAS engagement to facilitate this effort. And so the question is, what is next after this inauguration, after Nicaragua being declared an illegitimate election? Carlos Fernando, you have stressed that external pressure is fundamental to restore freedoms in Nicaragua, given the fact that, you reported the national police increased from 10,000 to 19,000 members in 3 years. And that basically almost every Nicaraguan is under threat, living on a situation of fear. So what is it that you think, what the kind of pressure is needed from the United States, the European Union, and Nicaraguan civic forces beyond sanctions, for example, that can move the needle towards prisoner release and political reforms? And Ana Lucia, you have worked, you have relatives in prison, you have seen the conditions of political prisoners. And so the question is, what are relatives of the prisoners expecting from national and international leaders to do to get them free under these false accusations? Jesus, you have been a leader in the past 4 years of the Nicaraguan civic movement towards dealing with a democratic transition in the country. And the question that everybody asks is, well, is the opposition in a position to change the status quo in Nicaragua? Can you achieve prisoner release? Is it possible to pressure Nicaragua from within in order to get something moving in a positive direction? And finally, Gonzalo, Secretary Almagro was given a deadline to report back to the member states of the Organization of American States, and he requested the deadline to be passed to January 12th, January 11th, to basically report on his efforts to connect, to communicate good offices, good relations, engagement with the Nicaraguan government. What has come out of that, and what else can the Secretary General do on these regards? And with that, I open the questions to you, and please welcome President Chinchilla.
Well, good morning. Thank you, Manuel, and thank you, Mike, and the Dialogue for hosting this event. Look, Daniel's speech during his presidential inauguration was largely consistent with the one he delivered right after the electoral farce, when he attacked and denigrated the political prisoners. In his interventions, he has shown no signs of regret or reconciliation. On the contrary, after Daniel's words, Rosario addressed also the media that day, and she referred to the tragic events of April 2018 as fueled by terrorists and evil people who hate Nicaragua. So I am deeply skeptical that we can expect any conciliatory and constructive attitude from the Ortega Murillos. So the only way they want is to continue clinging to power under their own rules. They won't move until three conditions concord. The first is if they feel asphyxiated by the international pressure. The second one is the support of some of its international allies is weakened. And the third is if there is a growing discontent and tensions among the population. So in order to create those conditions and to answer to the second question that Manuel asked me about what do I recommend to international players, I think that the following actions must be considered. First, to intensify target and individual sanctions like visa and travel restrictions, freezing of access, and opening investigations for money laundering, drug trafficking, and human rights violations. Those measures should be directed towards members of the Ortega Murillo family, their close allies, and the regime's key officials. The sanctions announced on the very same day Daniel was sworn in by the Council of Europe and the United States Department of State and Treasury were timely and relevant. It is essential to escalate this kind of pressures and to consider at some point to sanction Daniel Ortega himself. Number two, to direct those kind of sanctions and other sanctions towards key institutions like the Army, particularly the Army's Pension and Investment Fund, which is the major investor groups, one of the major investor groups in that country, with assets invested in the United States stock market and in treasury bonds. And number three, to consider broad economic, financial, and even trade sanctions. The flow of resources from international and regional financial organizations should be blocked. In the case of funds already allocated, and it must be articulated and designed a mechanism between the IFIS and the UN agency, which are implementing those loans. So we can be able to ensure that international funding goes strictly to humanitarian purposes. Also, at some point, it is necessary to review Nicaragua's participation in CAFTA agreement, not necessarily for a total suspension, but for the activation of key provisions, particularly towards groups directly linked to the regime. Finally, it is worth to mention that the sanctions must be supported by a clear and coherent diplomatic strategy, reinforced by a solid alliance of countries from both the hemisphere and other regions. In that sense, and here I am concluding, the OAS must continue working or moving towards the application of Article 21, implementing the recommendations approved by the Permanent Council on last December, and other multilateral institutions should be activated as well, especially the United Nations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ambassador.
Thank you so much, Manuel, and thank you, Michael Shifter, as well, and the dialogue for giving the opportunity to be here this morning. And it's a pleasure to be on a panel with such distinguished colleagues as well. I know there's a number of points to raise this morning. I wanted to make a couple in response to the two questions that you posed. I think to give some context, Canada remains deeply troubled by the political crisis in Nicaragua. You'll have seen our involvement in what we have said in the months prior, our deep concern with the spiral into authoritarianism. The so-called inauguration 2 days ago of Daniel Ortega was, Michael, as you noted, an event that followed an election that lacked any democratic legitimacy at all, a sham election. And your question, I think, to Manuel, to me, had two parts. One was the general question about how we would interpret the tabula rasa statement that Ortega made at his inauguration, and then a specific question about the OAS. I don't think I'd want to try myself to interpret what Daniel Ortega might have meant by that statement, but what I would say is, I think it's fair to say what it cannot mean, and what it cannot mean is that we forget the events of April 2018. The roots of the crisis in Nicaragua in many ways can be traced back to those events that took place, the violent response to the social protests that took place that year, reportedly resulting in the deaths of at least 328 people, including children and adolescents, and many being injured. And since that time, Canada has taken a number of steps to try to press for solutions to the situation in Nicaragua, including co-chairing the Nicaragua Working Group at the OAS, including imposing sanctions on members of the Ortega regime for their role in gross and systemic violations of human rights in that country, and other points that we can talk about as the discussion goes on if there's interest. But with that as sort of a background, I wanted to focus specifically on your question about the OAS. And I think the OAS for us is a key element of our approach. There was a reference to the resolution that was adopted most recently, a little bit more than a month ago. There's been a series of resolutions, but as you noted at the beginning, this was a resolution that was overwhelmingly supported by the membership, by more than 2/3 of the members of the organization. I think that's quite significant and quite important. And I think the text of the resolution itself is well worth reading. It not only calls for the immediate release of political prisoners, and it also identifies, I think, quite clearly in where the Ortega regime has fallen short of its commitments under the Inter-American Democratic Charter. But it also opens up a channel of communication, or at least potentially opens up a channel of communication to try to bring the government of Nicaragua back into line with its commitments under the Inter-American Democratic Charter. I think the amount of support there was for that resolution makes it clear that this is not just a Canadian concern. It's a concern that's shared amongst the membership in a very broad sense. The resolution, as you know, asks, the Permanent Council asked the Secretary General to seek a meeting with the government of Nicaragua to try to get the government of Nicaragua's commitment to accept a high-level good offices mission. Once the Secretary General has reported back to the Permanent Council, then members of the organization will have to make a decision as to what to do next. And so those discussions will have to take place after that report back to the Permanent Council. But for our part, for Canada's part, I know we'll continue to work with the members of the organization and other members of the international community to try to press the regime to live up to its commitments. And we stand ready to play a constructive role in those efforts. I'd like to conclude by saying we also stand in solidarity with the people of Nicaragua, exiles, political prisoners, and fully support all of the calls that we've heard for media freedom, respect for human rights, and the ability of the people in Nicaragua to make their own democratic choices in free and fair and transparent elections. Thank you, Manuel.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Carlos Fernando.
Thanks to the Inter-American Dialogue, and good morning for the audience and my other colleagues in this panel. Ortega's inaugural speech is more important for what he didn't say than for his rhetoric and the few things he said explicitly. With his silence, he made clear that the current police state, which means no democratic freedoms at all, is a permanent pillar of his government. So there will be a permanent cancellation of freedom of reunion and mobilization, freedom of the press and freedom of expression, maintaining political prisoners and his repressive laws. I believe his tabula rasa reference was directed towards the private sector in reference to the economy, but it also has a political resonance for the victims of the repression. In her after-speech comments, which is a kind of what El Comandante really wanted to say, Rosario Murillo complained about the betrayal of the alliance model by the private sector during the April 2018 rebellion. How this tabula rasa proposal will be translated in practical terms is something that we might see in the next month, probably not in a national dialogue with prominent business leaders, but in a series of technical and economic bilateral meetings with different sectors of the business community: banking, free export zone, textiles, agro-industry, coffee and cattle production, construction, gold export, tobacco exports, attempting to reestablish a working relationship based strictly on economic aspects without any negotiation of the political crisis. So despite international isolation and the lack of democratic legitimacy, Ortega already has a middle-run strategy to strengthen his ruling power, maintaining repression and offering some economic incentives for business. The question that we should be discussing is what is the middle-run strategy of the pro-democracy movement in Nicaragua and the international community to weaken Ortega power. I'm afraid we're still in the process of escalation of repression, and Ortega is not going to give up unless he faces an extraordinary and much more effective national and international pressure that provokes an internal breakdown within the regime, forcing his exit from power. If there is going to be a negotiation of a democratic transition, I believe it won't happen while Ortega and Murillo are in power. And this requires a gradual process of restoration of domestic freedoms with the participation of civil resistance, the church, and the private sector, in which the liberation of all political prisoners will be a turning point. Finally, the US and European Union international sanctions exercise some pressure, but they don't have a key impact in the domestic situation. How do you establish that conditionality between foreign pressure and restoring democratic freedom? Is not a short-run issue, and I think it should be discussed between policymakers and leaders of the democratic movement, but it is a middle-run strategy. And equally important is the support to the pro-democracy movement and civil society in Nicaragua, including the media. And I believe this strategy should at least focus on some specific areas. Some of them were mentioned by President Chinchilla, that include the army, the police, the public employees, the Central American Integration Bank, the IMF, the World Bank, and the Inter-American Development Bank. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos. That takes us to more the domestic issues, as you suggest, coordinating efforts between the international community and the Nicaraguan opposition. Ana Lucia, where do you see the relatives of political prisoners expecting? What do you see happening?
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you to the Inter-American Dialogue for inviting me to this event. I firmly believe that having this type of conversations are crucial to the future of Nicaragua. Well, as a relative of 3 political prisoners, Tamara, Ana Margarita, and Dora Maria, if I might, I first will focus on the consequence of for over 170 political prisoners of a new Ortega period. It implies further uncertainty about their situation. Not knowing what to expect is a form of torture, not only for the prisoner, but also for us, our families. Prison is not just about detention, but a systematic violation of human rights that continues and seems or feel never ending. Ever since my sister and my aunts are in jail, they have been subject to sustained tortures such as isolation, solitary confinement, interrogation at random hours held 3 times a day for more than 6 months, constant obstacles to the exercise of their rights. And this is the history for more than 170 political prisoners in the present, but also for more than 1,500 people since 2018. The physical and emotional impact prisoners in the present, physical and emotional impact for this direct and sustained forms of torture towards the prisoners are evident. The most noticeable is the drastic weight loss of most of them, between 30 and 60 pounds. The emotional impact is more difficult to describe, but the fact that one of the prisoners, Roger Reyes, does not remember the name of his daughter gives an idea. Again, this is a direct and systematic effort at breaking the political prisoner, as well as the spirit of them, but also of the entire country. Despite this, they remain in good spirit and not losing hope and maintaining firm their position and their beliefs. In regards to your first question, impunity has been a constant throughout Nicaraguan political history and transition. So Ortega appealed to that in his speech. Nicaragua has always relied on impunity to solve its problems. But at the end, the problem was not solved. Proof of that is our history is a constant spiral of events that repeat every 30 years. With the fall of Somoza, a process of expropriation and imprisonment was conducted rather than a process of justice. Neither justice or truth happened after the revolution and civil wars in the 80s. At the end, just a series of superficial political agreements. As you can tell by his speech, Ortega is firmly rooted in the past, but the Nicaragua and the world that he describes no longer exists. Unlike other periods of time in Nicaraguan history, the values relate to justice, truth, memory, and no impunity are sustained by, I think, the most powerful social movement that remains against all odds and despite repression and death in Nicaragua today. And it is the broad movement of victims and families of victims either of lethal violence or political prison. In contrast with other periods of times, justice is at the heart of the imaginary of the new social contract. Therefore, it must be clear that any organization or political process which seeks legitimacy must be consequent to this new imaginary of social contract. Regarding to your second question, what are the relative of political prisoners expecting from national and international leaders? Well, I would like first to clarify that I'm not speaking on the behalf of all families of all 170 political prisoners. As you may know, we are a diverse and heterogenic group in many ways, but some thoughts may be that, well, first, the international community has been a very active, and we are very grateful for this. However, we believe that much more can be done. For example, the same determination that some governments present when addressing human rights in Geneva needs to be translated in further efforts in obtaining at least humanitarian treatment to the prisoner, as well as a fair legal procedure, if not demanding the freedom due to their democratic belief. They also can further condition assistance to funding to access, for example, by the International Federation of the Red Cross, among others. Another concern is whether everyone is aware of the core importance of the problem of liberty deprivation for the transition process for both Nicaragua, but also for the region. The new authoritarian regimes political prison is essential to maintain their power and control of society, and therefore it is essential to destabilize these new forms of authoritarianism by rethinking how to address this specific issue in transitional process and how to include this topic in the agenda of justice. For example, for the Inter-American system, the Inter-American system does not include deprivation of liberty as a serious violation of human rights. Comparative justice process have not considered political prison as a main issue in justice. The problem of deprivation of liberty has not been central in the agenda of justice in any of the transition of the region. Therefore, if we achieve to include it in Nicaragua, it will contribute to provide justice for more than 1,500 Nicaraguans, but also a big contribution to the region, not only because it's a matter of justice, but also it contributes to guarantee no repetition. To the national leaders, we demand congruence between discourse and political practice, not only when to negotiate, but also to be able to construct a political platforms that can make all those change possible. Finally, as a human rights defender, I strongly believe that the broad human rights movement in Nicaragua has the big important responsibility both to ensure that the agenda of justice is at the forefront, as well as to hold politicians accountable during any possible negotiation, establishing a transparent and accountable truth-seeking process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria Lucia. And speaking of one of the recommendations of congruence, Jesus, what can we expect of the opposition? Are they in a position to continue and succeed in pressure?
Hi, hello to the Inter-American Dialogue. Thank you for the invitation and thank you to my colleagues for their presentations. Well, first, respect to the first question, I think the tabula rasa means that Ortega knows that the former economic and political model crashed with no possibilities to be reconstructed. So he's proposing a new model for his so-called new mandate with new players like China, for example. We've seen all the new agreements that he has, commercial agreements, the Silk Road agreements with China. And so he wants to sell these agreements to his people, to private actors in Nicaragua as an opportunity to build a new model, a new economic and political model. He expects that the Sandinista bases believe that he's capable of managing the country through this international isolation, that his illegitimacy is provoking. But I don't believe, and we in the opposition don't believe that he's going to be able to go through this isolation and maintain the loyalty of the bases as he is maintaining until now. Regarding to the second question, we currently in the opposition, all the leaders right now are in prison, exile, or hidden in Nicaragua. We are passing through a hard time right now because of the repression. Ortega closed all the possibilities of doing politics within Nicaragua soil in the traditional way. Like as we used to do in team, making demonstrations in the streets, gathering in private spaces. But within Nicaragua, there is a political majority that rejects Ortega right now. Even though we cannot act as we used to because of the repression, there is a political majority. We saw that in all the polls with a tendency during the 2020 and 2021. But we also proved that in the electoral process on 7th of November of the past year, where nobody went to vote, there was an enormous abstention that we were able to observe during this process. So even the people who were being forced to go to vote didn't go, and this, it's a big message for the people even that are working on the state, on the government, that were forced to go to vote, and some of them, many of them, didn't go, facing consequences, bad consequences, and repression from the dictatorship. The main objective of the opposition is to take advantage of the freedom that exile guarantees for the ones that are in the exile, and that political majority that I talked before, that we know that there is in Nicaragua, to create an unfavorable environment for Ortega. To achieve this, the social and political organizations that are connected to the territorial bases are fundamental, since they are the only ones that can find communication mechanisms to circumvent the repression and media censorship that the regime has implemented. It's very difficult right now to communicate between opposition members in different cities and different towns. So right now, the networks that we've built during these past 3 years and even before are crucial to the next steps in opposition right now, in making politics and a politics change, in advocacy, and even in gathering information of what's happening, all the human rights violations that are happening in Nicaragua, and being able to bring them to the international concert. But these organizations, all the political organizations, the opposition or for democracy movements, are also crucial for coordinating the efforts of the Nicaraguan people and the efforts of the international community. All the pressure that can be done inside Nicaragua has to be coordinated with the pressure that can be done internationally. Only with effective coordination are we going to free, that's my belief, the political prisoners, and change the political scheme in Nicaragua. In the past, for example, in 2018, there was a massive demonstration of protest in Nicaragua, and the international community was not synchronized with that pressure in that moment. After the repression, where all the protest was going down, all the international community started to pressure, but it was not in a synchronized way. So I think leadership and political organizations are crucial to make that synchrony between local pressure and international pressure, so that we can weaken Ortega in the most effective way. Another important aspect is that Ortega no longer represents solutions for the Nicaraguan people. It has been shown that, on the contrary, it's the main cause of economic and social deterioration in the country. It is very shocking to see that the dictatorships affect even people who have been loyal to them, and in the past months, as a result of, I think, paranoia, it has repressed public officials and members of the ruling party. That constitutes another of our objectives, which is to make our Nicaraguan brothers and sisters see that there's future, see that a future in democracy and freedoms, where the rule of law is respected, is better than living in the dictatorships that affect the families, even those closest to the ruling party. It's important that we all know that there is a future after Ortega, and as more people understand it, the support structures of the dictatorship will weaken, and we will be closer to achieving freedom. And that's a work that we as oppositors need to do. We have to change our message. We have to make a message not to isolate every people who is working on the state or on the government. They have to feel part of the next Nicaragua, of the future Nicaragua, and that's something that we need to change in our speech. We need to gather people, not separate people. Right now, polarization, social polarization, has made like a lot of damage to the social network inside Nicaragua. We've started different process of internal dialogue and coordination in order to consolidate more coherent opposition in its message and more united in its actions. We no longer have the distraction. We have no longer the distraction of elections, of the electoral process that we had last year. Now we are focused on freeing political prisoners, returning to our country, and establish democracy and the rule of law. We not only have to weaken Ortega, we also have to strengthen Nicaragua's democratic forces. We have seen that working separately in the past does not guarantee any success, so we need to make things differently. So that's why the internal dialogue and consultation, it's crucial to the next steps. We've started many processes of coordination, but we still have a long road to in the future months, so that we can build something new, something strong, something coherent that can bring hope to Nicaragua, which is the other thing that it's being lost due to the dictatorship. Political prisoners are our friends, family, colleagues, loved ones, but for Ortega, they are exchange tokens that no one can redeem at the moment. This is why, in the face of any possible credible negotiation, political prisoners must be released beforehand. Otherwise, a negotiation to solve the problem of a country, of an entire country, in all its aspects, will turn into a negotiation for hostages before a kidnapper. This is very important because it might happen that in the future we see an attempt to negotiate from the regime to different sectors. And as Carlos Fernando said before, we cannot let that the political prisoners are being used to force opposition or to force population to accept or to legitimate Ortega to remain in power with impunity. It's imperative that the international community accompany the families of political prisoners and Nicaraguan organizations to demand the freedom of our political prisoners. Without the freedom, without the possibility to exercise leadership in Nicaragua, I fear that there's no possibility to make an important and crucial change to the future of Nicaraguans. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jesus. That coordination is an important message. And Gonzalo, I think part of the effort on coordination involves the Secretary General's good offices. So welcome.
Thank you, Manuel, and thank you, Michael, and thanks to the Inter-American Dialogue for allowing me, on behalf of the General Secretariat of the Organization of American States, to be part of this timely discussion today. I'm very honored to share the panel with such distinguished personalities as President Chinchilla, Ambassador Ratset, Carlos Fernando, Ana Lucia, Jesus. Yes, tabula rasa was your general question, and the meaning of tabula rasa in the context of the ceremonies 2 days ago. In many ways, Daniel Ortega, Rosario Murillo have already done their tabula rasa before last Monday. They have already, in their own terms, proceeded with their tabula rasa, incarcerating all political candidates, incarcerating political activists, suppressing freedom of expression, suppressing civil and political liberties, forcing this huge migration of Nicaraguans that we have across the region and beyond. So, of course, that's not acceptable. And the only way forward is precisely the contrary, is reversing this tragic situation that Nicaragua is living by immediately releasing all political prisoners, by immediately restoring civil and political liberties, by restoring freedom of expression, by restoring institutionality to the country, which means, of course, it is not in the way that the illegitimate elections were conducted. That's the way in which the country should be moving forward. And I was seeing that there is, of course, a lot of common ground within the panelists about the future of the country, what the future should be. But I want to focus on your specific question, Manuel, about the role of the General Secretariat and of Secretary General Almagro in the context of the works in Nicaragua. And as you know, and as Ambassador Adset mentioned, Permanent Council in December, a few weeks ago, requested Secretary General Almagro to start contact with Managua, with Ortega Murillo, in order to facilitate a good offices mission by Permanent Council members to the country. And you also said, Manuel, that is really a difficult task. And of course, I'm not going to proceed with the Secretary General will go to the Permanent Council when he has the results to comment to permanent representatives accredited to the OAS. But I want to remember, of course, it is very difficult to work with Managua and with Ortega Murillo in this context. It is something that we all know. But at the same time, General Secretariat of the Organization of American States, and let me go back a few months/years in the past, has been one of the few, if not the only stakeholder that was able to deliver some results in the context of the tragic situation in Nicaragua. Let's go back to 2016, let's go back to 2017. In 2017, the OAS had an electoral observation mission to the regional elections in Nicaragua, which main result and conclusion was that from that electoral observation mission, we have today, and we have had in the last months, and this was the basis of the works of the Permanent Council and many organizations in Nicaragua and beyond Nicaragua, to know what the electoral reform should be in the country. What are the changes that should take place in order to have free and fair elections in Nicaragua? That is the result of the electoral observation mission of 2017 mainly. We had in that year too, we negotiated with Ortega Murillo the possibility of the CIDH, the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, to get into the country, to establish the Grupo Interdisciplinario de Expertos Independientes, which is also the main source that from the Inter-American system we have in terms of violations of human rights in Nicaragua. 2019, the General Secretariat of the Organization of American States with Luis Almagro and especially Special Envoy Luis Rosadilla and the Nuncio Apostolico took part in the conversations that ended by the release of more than 300 political prisoners in that moment. Political prisoners are the most urgent concern that the international community should have, of course, about Nicaragua, and the release of political prisoners should be absolutely complete and absolutely immediate. So I'm recalling this just to say it is very difficult, the way forward. It is very difficult, the task ahead. But Secretary Almagro, General Secretariat, we are working relentlessly every day in this sense to see if there's the possibility of reversing this tragic situation that the country is living. We think Nicaragua every day, we work Nicaragua every day, and we know it is a really huge task, and our solidarity always with Nicaraguans in the country and abroad that are suffering the consequences of the tragic situation. But having had some results in the past, we still think it is really, really difficult, but it is worth, of course, to continue working in this sense. I will leave it here, Manuel, and of course open for the Q&A section. Thank you.
Thank you, Gonzalo. Indeed, the main challenge, I think, that comes out and the lessons learned is predominantly that the government of Ortega Murillo have basically bet or estimated that the risk of a proportional response to the level of repression from the international community will be low. And the question really that comes across that I throw back to all of you is basically, how realistic can we be that the international community can offer a stronger response in the way of what President Chinchilla, Carlos Fernando have pointed out. And I think, that some of the people in the audience are asking predominantly this kind of question, how realistic is it that the efforts of the OAS, both the Secretary General and the member states, can actually increase more pressure to get something important as the release of the prisoners and then reset the political environment. Another question that comes across from the audience is about the role of the diaspora. Nicaragua is a relatively small country, less than 7 million people, 6.7 million people. And so far, only last year, nearly 170,000 people left the country. And the increase of migration took place after May, when the repression intensified. So we're talking about nearly 1 million Nicaraguans living abroad. And so the question is, what role does the diaspora have to play on this international effort? And another question that comes across has to do with something that Carlos Fernando mentioned, that this effort to synchronize, to coordinate international and domestic pressure needs to be tied to the government strategy, predominantly this piecemeal approach to deal with the private sector on an industry or even on a firm level, rather than in the broader spectrum of talking to what is called the Gran Capital. So how likely is it to get the private sector to not lend itself to this? And the Catholic Church in particular, how realistic is it to see the role of the Catholic Church, the role of the Vatican? I understood recently, for example, that the Pope was not aware there were political prisoners in Nicaragua until 4 weeks ago. So, what is going on with these issues? Chu talks about synchronizing international efforts, and this is just an illustration of a synchronic situation. So I'm going to open the floor. We have a few questions from the audience in addition to those ones. Specifically, one more that was asked is, what can we expect with Nicaragua and the Chinese relations? I think, Laura, you mentioned something to the extent to which it's important to also minimize these new alliances. And, where does China comes along in this? To what extent it's really China becoming a formidable ally to Nicaragua, or is mostly a symbolic effort? So I'll leave you these questions for you to answer in the same order. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you for the questions. Let me just refer very briefly to how realistic the pressures from the international community can be, and what happens with the new role China is supposed to play. I think that only if the international community understands that the situation won't change in Nicaragua unless they apply harder kind of measures, I think that will be the only way to bring them on a more kind of consequential attitude. But again, I think that what we saw in the last 48 hours reflects that kind of realistic and approach and a very consistent until now attitude coming from the United States and the European Union. Of course, that is not enough. We need to add some additional measures. But again, let us not be under any illusion. Daniel will only understand under extremely pressured conditions. And that is the main message to the international community. Now, let me say something about China. I think that China's supporting plan, as it is announced by Daniel Ortega, is much more a kind of mirage than a realistic one. You cannot transform, and I can tell you because I engaged in relations with China, and we signed a free trade agreement 10 years ago, and you cannot transform an economy traditionally trading with the United States market to trade with a new market, so different from what we are accustomed to. And finally, if economic and financial measures are not taken that can create a menace, a realistic menace on the business community in Nicaragua, I am afraid that they will start negotiating one by one with the Nicaraguan government. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador.
I wanted to pick up on a couple of the comments and the questions that you had put to us, Manuel, all of which I think are quite important, but just let me focus on a couple, and one in particular, which is this question of maintaining some degree of solidarity amongst the various actors. And I think there's two parts to this. One is, and it was referred to by some of the other panelists this morning, the significant importance of ensuring that democratic actors within Nicaragua are working together and continue to work together to put pressure on the regime domestically, and recognizing the significant challenges, obviously, that come with that. And I think I don't want to say it's the other hand or as part of that as well, there's a need, and this was, I thought, quite eloquently referred to in the context of perhaps what didn't happen prior to April 2018, but a need for the international community as well to maintain a degree of solidarity and to build broad international support. Now, one of the ways that we try to do that, of course, is through the OAS. And again, I think I wouldn't want to understate the significance of the work done within the OAS and the efforts made to build a degree of solidarity within that organization, which is not always an easy task. And part of the challenge in doing that is sometimes having the information widely available and well understood as to what the situation is on the ground. And I was quite struck by the comment about the Pope and the information about the situation in Nicaragua, perhaps not always reaching the levels where it needs to reach. So I think events like this and other ways to ensure that there's a broad, clear, fact-based understanding of what is actually happening is actually quite key to being able to maintain that international level of support for keeping pressure on. And I think for that reason as well, to maintain links with what is happening domestically and the efforts made by actors, democratic actors within Nicaragua is also key to making this happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Carlos Fernando.
I want to emphasize that this is a crisis that requires a middle-run strategy, both by the Nicaraguan democracy, the pro-democracy movement, and the international community. It is not a short-run problem that requires a short-run solution. And it is equally important, the issue about how to target sanctions that will have any impact within the government, within the army, within the police, within the pillars of economic support, and also a strategy to support the pro-democracy movement and civil society, including the private sector and the church. I believe it is key that the private sector recovers its civic role. I'm not talking about the private sector leading any kind of political solution, but becoming a counterpower in terms of civic pressure to the government. That looks completely impossible in this moment, but in the middle run, there will be a time for that kind of pressure, and also the importance of the church. And regarding the international community, I would like to take advantage of this forum with my role as a journalist to ask Gonzalo to be more explicit about what can we expect from the OAS and the Secretary General, because it's not clear. I mean, what's the OAS going to do with Ortega simply blocking any kind of possibility of a diplomatic negotiation. What kind of pressure is the OAS capable of exercising? And also there's another question about the past, and I think it's important what the OAS have done in the past, but there's also important to recognize the missing links between the international community and the Nicaraguan crisis. When in 2019, there were two important agreements in a negotiation table between the government and the Civic Alliance. One of them was the release of political prisoners. Yes, Ortega complied partially, but the other one was the restoration of political freedoms. And there were two witnesses, the Vatican and the OAS in that table, and nothing happened. Ortega simply didn't comply with the agreements that he accepted in the negotiation table. So that tell us about a diplomacy that doesn't have a capability to to pressure the government to oblige with the agreements that they did. And I think that that's an important point for the future. That's why I don't really believe there is any feasible, any possible solution in a political negotiation with Ortega. Only without Ortega and Murillo, I believe there is a possibility of political transition. How do you get them out of power? Well, exercising extreme political, national, and international pressure. That will have to create a new balance of power in the country. And that's why I'm emphasizing about the middle ground strategy.
Thank you. Ana Lucia.
Yes. I think that more than a political project, the regime is an economical project. So therefore, all the efforts that can be done in order to sockavate the basis of this economical project that is based on this is valuable. Not only with economical pressure, with economical sanction, but also there are corporations in international corporations that are still doing business with the regime. So all the efforts that we can do in our countries in order to see how this works, I think it will be a gain. Another thing is that civil society is doing a lot of efforts in order to repression has names. So we need to identify the individual responsibilities behind all the repression. So all the efforts that international community can do in order to help civil society in Nicaragua in the efforts of documentation, of registration of human rights violation, but also in how the repression structure works in Nicaragua in order to be able to identify individual responsibilities is, I think, important in order to sockavate the basis of the regime. I agree with Carlos Fernando that we need to change a correlation of forces in Nicaragua in order to be able to do something about a transition. And I strongly believe that one of the ways to do that is keep sockavating the bases that sustain the regime and that still support the regime. And in order to do that, the responsible of the repression in all these forms needs to know that this is one of the pillars that civil society in union with international community we are working for in order to establish individual responsibilities in what is happening and what happened in Nicaragua. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesus.
Well, with all due respect for my colleagues of the diplomatic community, I think that diplomatic mechanisms right now are outdated to manage a dictator like Ortega. In the past, we saw that the OAS asked, for example, the former dictator Anastasio Somoza in Nicaragua to leave the country, and he complied because it was another time, another context. But right now, these kind of dictators like Ortega are not vulnerable for these diplomatic measures. So I think when a mechanism is outdated, all the democratic communities need to figure out what new mechanisms are going to use to solve a problem that is not only located in Nicaragua. We have many dictators in Latin America, and we have an incentive if we don't change the course of a democracy of a dictatorship like the Nicaraguan one. We are incentivizing other leaders, other authoritarian leaders in other countries of the region to go ahead with the dictatorship or with the dictatorial project. Because Ortega, Maduro, and some others are showing that the actual mechanisms are not ready for a model like the one they are implementing. So I'm very worried about what can we do. It's a thing that we need to take in account like a priority in the region. In another, I'm mostly agree with Ana Lucia what she said about the pillars and Carlos Fernando about the pillars that sustain Ortega. I think repression, it's a chain. It's a chain that goes from the couple of Ortega and Murillo to the one who execute the repression. So in that chain, we have individuals, and we have evidence about the individuals in the chain that manages the repression and manages the corruption. So since we don't have justice in Nicaragua, justice court that can apply justice to these criminals, well, we have to find other alternative solutions, and those can be the solutions that the international community can help us to build in order to show that the perpetrators of human rights violations and corruption acts will pay, if not in Nicaragua, within the Nicaraguan territory, because we're not yet there, but in the international space, in other countries, with international opinion and pressure. We don't have institutions in Nicaragua, or the ones we have, we cannot rely on them. So we need to find alternatives. And that's a way that the international community can help with bilateral sanctions, pressure, as we've been seeing in the last days, but we need to get more specific in the areas that hurt to the regime. Thank you.
Gonzalo, you had a question from
Gracias, Manuel.
panel.
Yes, a few words on the different topics and the question. On pressure and international pressure. Yes, of course, international pressure is absolutely relevant and necessary, because this will sound obvious, but when there is no pressure, you don't have pressure. And if, for instance, you deprive a regime of a certain amount of money, $50 million, okay, that might not end the regime, but if the regime had those $50 million, things would be much worse, and it could be more tragic and more dramatic in terms of what can be done by the perpetrators. So yes, pressure, international pressure, and the diaspora pressure is absolutely relevant. Part of the question that you asked, Manuel, was related to the role of the diaspora. The role of the diaspora and the role of the pro-democracy Nicaraguan movement is, of course, what Jesus, Ana Lucia, Carlos Fernando are doing right now, challenging and keeping the situation, keeping the subject alive in the international community and in the work of everyday international organizations and member states of the international community, in order to keep insisting, saying what is happening in Nicaragua, providing information, providing reliable information. Private sector, Catholic Church, of course, the solution and the restoration of democracy in Nicaragua must involve all actors in the country. So they have a very relevant role to play. Carlos Fernando was asking, and it is a very good question, about the results of 2019 negotiations. One of the outcomes was the release of more than 300 political prisoners. That was very, very important because it was 300 persons and 300 and the relatives of those 300 persons. That is really, and we still say the same today about political prisoners. That is the first priority, their immediate release. But yes, it is true. In 2019, Ortega Murillo did not fulfill all the agreements that were reached in that negotiating table. And they did not fulfill even earlier many of the agreements that they had with the General Secretariat, for instance. I mentioned the electoral observation mission of 2017 in the regional elections. There, the EOM, the electoral observation mission, reached some conclusions and gave some recommendations that were totally ignored, but totally ignored. They didn't fulfill that. We had this dialogue for the restoration of institutions in Nicaragua, in the country. We reached agreements, they were totally ignored. We had agreed on an electoral reform. The electoral reform was approved, was made public. The program, the timeline was made public. Did they comply? Of course, they did not. So yes, there is a lot of unfulfilled agreements by Ortega Murillo, Carlos Fernando, and we all know it, and that is what makes the task even more difficult, and that makes us have to work even harder in order to try to reach some results. I wouldn't say success, because what is a success in this context? I would say some kind of results that help us reverse the situation in the country. And that is the role of international organizations. I commend the role of the General Assembly and the Permanent Council that were able to reach a very important degree of consensus in order to approve the resolutions in Nicaragua. Please remember, only in the last 3 months, we had a GA resolution, General Assembly resolution, a Permanent Council resolution in October, General Assembly resolution in November, Permanent Council resolution in December. This is not something that happens every day at the OAS, nor in any other international organization. So our work, member states, General Secretariat, is completely focused in Nicaragua today, and we are aware of the tragic situation the country is going through and Nicaraguans are going through. Gracias, Manuel.
Gracias, Gonzalo. And we basically have reached to the end of our meeting, and just want to summarize some of these discussions. There are a few other questions that were not we were not able to touch on. But I think the most important conclusion in summary is that you all agreed that a solution to a proportional response to the level of repression that exists in a country like Nicaragua, and unfortunately is a benchmark of what are the, how much can the international community tolerate from non-democratic practices. Has to be first to amplify and accelerate the role of sanctions, both individual and institutional. Also to put more focus on the economic side of pressure in the way of reviewing trade relations, but also in the way of applying some forms of economic diplomacy in a way that also connects the private sector, which is vulnerable, but also partly some people in the audience say they are silenced to what is going on in the country. So economic pressure, economic diplomacy is fundamental. And the third important element relates to the international community engagement and relationship with the democratic opposition, which in itself gives more legitimacy to their work, even among those who are in exile or in clandestine in the country. And finally, the issue of the diaspora is a really it's a difficult one. We have at least 800,000 Nicaraguans, nearly 1 million people abroad. Most of them have left for political reasons in the past 4 years, and their messaging and their role, it's part of the solution to Nicaraguans in their home country. One of the paradoxes of repression is that it was remittances that maintained a macroeconomic growth in the country last year. And so, you know, the diaspora has a role to play in a constructive way to keep pressuring the regime, and messaging to the relatives might be one of the ways to deal with that. And so those are some of the conclusions perhaps that come across from the audience. And I leave it to Michael to close. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Manuel. And I really, you know, I think you said it all, summed it up very, very well. And I just think this was a really incredibly interesting, thoughtful exchange and discussion. And I just want to, you know, there's a lot more to talk about. I think there are a lot of issues that have been raised that deserve, I think, more in-depth kind of discussion and follow up. And the dialogue will be continuing to do this under Manuel's great leadership. So I just want to thank him. I want to thank all of the wonderful speakers, President Chinchilla, Carla Fernando, Ambassador Adset, my good friend, Jesus, Ana Lucia, and of course, Gonzalo Conque for their great contributions and participation in this effort, and also to the over 200 people who did join the discussion. I think is a reflection of the interest. There's one question that came up about, is there fatigue on Nicaragua? And some fatigue, I think, is understandable. And I think that's an element. But I think that we need to have a core group that can sustain the interest, and I think, and the pressure, and keep thinking about strategically about how to deal with this incredibly profound and deep tragedy in our hemispheric community. So we'll be continuing to call on all of you again for further events, and we look forward to having all of the participants continue with our program. So thank you all very much. Stay well, stay healthy, and take good care of yourselves. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
Gracias.